My name is Bella, and at 30 years old, I walked into my birthday party to discover it was actually a liquidation event. The ballroom didn't smell of celebration. It smelled of sterilized ambition and impending foreclosure. My mother stood beneath the crushing weight of the crystal chandelier, presenting my DNA results not as a family tragedy, but as a bad investment report, labeling me a parasite to be excised from the corporate body. The air in the room compressed, heavy as wet concrete, squeezing the oxygen from my lungs. Then I saw it. Not the red folder waving in her hand, but the microfracture in her composure, a frantic pulse in her neck that didn't match her arrogance. The switch inside me flipped with the cold click of a safety latch disengaging. The weeping daughter died, replaced by the lead architect conducting a demolition survey. The silence in my head became absolute, loud enough to shatter glass. 3 months later, the winter frost had sealed the windows of the empty office. They had shredded the contracts and wiped the servers, arrogant in their thoroughness. But they forgot the object that acts as a silent witness, the yellowed tracing paper. It sat on the mahogany desk, its corner bent, ignored because they saw it as art, not evidence. They never checked the underside. There, scrawled in faint graphite, stood the anomaly. 18. It stood alone, stripped of units, a raw calculation of theft that had been rotting their foundation for decades. When the blueprint of your survival requires detonating the pillars of the family that raised you, do you have the surgical precision to pull the lever and watch them collapse? Or do you let the weight of their lie crush you into dust? Most people look at the facade of the Grand O Hotel and see luxury. They see the shimmering lights, the valet parking, the promise of a 5-star sleep. I don't see that. I stood on the sidewalk, the cold wind biting through my ivory suit, and I didn't see a hotel. I saw a math problem. I saw the load-bearing steel beams hidden behind the limestone cladding. I saw the cantilever of the entrance canopy, calculating the tension in the cables just like I did 3 years ago. I know exactly how much weight that roof can hold, because I spent 800 hours staring at the blueprints until my eyes bled. I drew every line. I calculated every stress point. But if you walk into the lobby and look at the brass plaque by the elevators, it doesn't say Bella Sterling. It says, Lead Architect, Madeline Sterling. My mother. I looked down at my wrist. My suit was perfect, tailored, expensive. The kind of armor you wear when you're trying to prove you belong. But on the left cuff, just barely visible, was a tiny smudge. Dark gray. It was a graphite stain from a 6B pencil. I had tried to scrub it out with stain remover, but it wouldn't budge. It was ironic, really. That stain was the only honest thing about my outfit. It was the mark of the worker, the shadow architect, the girl who stays up until 4 a.m. fixing the structural flaws while her mother is sleeping in silk sheets. That smudge was my secret signature, and looking at it gave me a sick feeling in my stomach, like I was standing on a glass floor that was about to crack. Why did I feel so heavy? It was my birthday, my 30th birthday. Just a small dinner, Madeline had said on the phone. Her voice had been sweet, too sweet, like syrup covering a pill. Just family, Bella. We want to celebrate you. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so bad. I'm 30 years old, but inside, there's still a 6-year-old kid waiting for her mom to put a drawing on the fridge. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the exhaust fumes of the city, and pushed through the heavy revolving doors. I was ready for balloons. I was ready for a cake. Maybe, just maybe, I was ready for an apology. I wasn't ready for the silence. The doors swished shut behind me, cutting off the noise of the street. The grand ballroom wasn't set up for a family dinner. The lights were too bright, aggressive, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers like interrogation lamps. And there were people, lots of them. But they weren't cousins or friends. I scanned the room, and my blood ran cold. I recognized the gray suits. I recognized the bald heads and the sharp, predatory eyes. That was Mr. Henderson from the board of directors. Over there, swirling a glass of scotch, was the chief financial officer. And near the window, whispering to a man I didn't know, was the head of the company's legal department. 100 guests, not a single smile. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Thump, thump, thump. This wasn't a party. You don't invite the investors to a birthday party unless you're merging companies or liquidating them. I tried to catch someone's eye, anyone's eye. I waved slightly at Mr. Henderson. I had saved his department $10 million last year by redesigning the HVAC system. He saw me. He looked right at me. And then he turned his back. He checked his watch. That's when I saw her. Madeline. She was standing at the head of a long, U-shaped table covered in white cloth. She looked radiant. She was wearing emerald green, the color of money, the color of envy. She was laughing at something a shareholder said, her head thrown back, exposing her long, elegant neck. But then she saw me. The laughter stopped instantly. It didn't fade away. It was cut off, like someone flipped a switch. She smiled, but I know my mother's face better than I know my own blueprints. I saw the micro-expression, a tiny twitch at the corner of her left eye, a tightening of the jaw muscle. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. It was the look she gave contractors right before she sued them. It was the look of a predator spotting a wounded animal. "Bella!" she called out. Her voice echoed in the cavernous room. "You're late." I wasn't late. I was 5 minutes early. I started walking toward her. The sound of my heels clicking on the marble floor sounded like gunshots. Click, click, click. Every step felt harder than the last. The air in the room felt thin, like all the oxygen had been sucked out by the important people. I clutched my purse tighter, feeling the graphite stain on my cuff rub against the leather. It was my anchor. I built this room, I told myself. I designed the acoustic paneling in the ceiling. I calculated the load of this floor. I am the architect. But why did I feel like the demolition target? I reached the main table. There were flowers, yes, massive arrangements of white lilies, funeral flowers. But there was something missing. I looked at the center of the table, right where Madeline was standing. I expected a cake. I expected "Happy Birthday" written in icing. I expected 30 candles flickering with warm, golden light. But there was no cake. Instead, sitting alone on the pristine white tablecloth was a thick folder. It was red, the color of warning, the color of danger. Madeline placed her hand on the folder. Her nails were painted the same emerald green as her dress. She tapped the cover twice. Tap, tap. The sound was dry and hollow. "Sit down, Bella," she said. It wasn't a request. I looked at her, then at the silent crowd of board members watching me with a mix of pity and hunger. My stomach dropped. The false safety shattered like the glass dome above us if the calculations had been wrong. I realized then that I had been so stupid. I had spent my whole life trying to build a foundation for this family, trying to earn my place with sweat and graphite and sleepless nights. I looked at the red folder again. I came here tonight to receive the first birthday cake of my life. I came here for a mother's love. But looking at the cold, hard faces of the people I had made rich, I realized the truth. The thing waiting for me on that table wasn't a celebration. It was an indictment. I didn't open the red folder immediately. I couldn't. My hand hovered over the textured cover, and for a split second, the cold leather felt exactly like the steel drafting table in the basement of this very hotel 5 years ago. That was the year Sterling Architects almost died. We were bleeding money. Madeline had overextended us on the waterfront project, gambling on a design that defied physics and the bank account. The company was days away from Chapter 11 bankruptcy. I remember the smell of stale coffee and fear. While Madeline was busy looking for a lawyer to negotiate a surrender, I was in the basement, rewriting the laws of gravity. I found a way to redistribute the load-bearing stress of the towers, cutting the steel requirement by 30% without losing stability. I worked for 72 hours straight. No sleep, no shower, just math and desperation. I saved the company. My redesign saved Sterling Architects $4 million in materials alone. That $4 million is the only reason we are sitting in this ballroom today. That $4 million is the only reason the lights are on. But when the ribbon was cut, Madeline stood on the podium. She held the golden scissors. She told the press it was her vision. I stood in the back, behind the caterers, holding her purse. I didn't say a word. Why? Why did I let them erase me? It wasn't because I was weak. It was because of the smell of antiseptic and fading lilies. It was because of Robert, my stepfather, the only father I ever knew. I looked down at the table, blinking away the sting in my eyes. I could still hear his voice, raspy and thin, from 3 years ago in the hospice ward. He had grabbed my hand, the same hand now trembling over this red folder, and squeezed it with his last ounce of strength. "Bella," he had whispered. "Madeline, she doesn't know how to build. She only knows how to shine. And Chloe is soft. Promise me you'll be the structure. Keep the roof over their heads." I promised a dying man I would be the invisible steel beams so his wife and daughter could be the glass facade. That promise was the only reason I tolerated the erasure. It was the only reason I swallowed the insults. I thought I was honoring him. I thought I was being the titan he believed I was. But looking around this table, I realized a titan can be brought down by 1,000 tiny cuts, or one very expensive handbag. A high-pitched giggle sliced through my thoughts. It came from 2 seats to my left. Chloe. My half-sister was slumped in her chair, looking bored. She was 22, beautiful in a way that took hours of effort to look effortless. She was tapping furiously on her phone with long, manicured nails that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. She wasn't looking at me. She wasn't looking at the board members. She was looking at her reflection in her spoon. My eyes drifted down to the floor beside her chair. There it was, an orange Hermes Birkin bag. It sat there like a trophy. I knew that bag. I knew it intimately. Last month, I processed the expense report. Chloe had listed the $15,000 purchase as client acquisition marketing. When I flagged it, Madeline told me to stop being petty and jealous. Jealous? I had to write a 3-page justification memo last week to the CFO explaining why I needed 2 rolls of A0 printing paper for the blueprints of the new library. I had to beg for paper to do my job, while Chloe bought the price of a small car to carry her lip gloss. The injustice burned in my throat like acid. I had kept the roof over their heads just like Robert asked, but I didn't realize they would use the shelter I built to lock me out. I shifted in my seat, and the light from the chandelier hit Chloe's water glass. Something sparkled. It wasn't the crystal. I narrowed my eyes. Chloe's phone wasn't just resting against the glass. It was propped up, carefully angled. The screen was dimmed to black, almost invisible, but the lens was facing directly at me. And there, reflecting in the curve of the glass, was a tiny, pulsing red dot. Live. My stomach dropped through the floor. This wasn't just a trial. It wasn't just an ambush by the board. Chloe had started a live stream. She had hidden the interface, but the camera was rolling. She was broadcasting this. They didn't just want to fire me. They didn't just want to take away my job. They wanted an audience for the execution. Madeline cleared her throat at the head of the table. The sound was sharp, commanding silence. She opened her own copy of the red folder. "Shall we begin?" she asked, her voice smooth as silk. I looked at the hidden camera lens. I looked at the graphite stain on my wrist. I looked at the woman who promised to love me. I realized then that Robert's promise was broken. The roof I built hadn't protected them. It had only given them a dry place to plot my murder. Madeline didn't know it yet, but she wasn't just starting a meeting. She was lighting a fuse, and she had no idea that the explosives were buried in the foundation she was standing on. The feedback from the microphone screeched through the ballroom, a high-pitched tear in the silence that made everyone flinch. It was the only sound in the room. Madeline didn't apologize for the noise. She didn't adjust the volume. She just stood there, behind the podium, gripping the edges like she was bracing for a storm, or perhaps starting one. I watched her hands. They were steady. My hands resting on my lap over the graphite stain on my cuff were shaking so hard I had to clasp them together to stop the vibration. "Thank you all for coming," Madeline said. Her voice wasn't warm. It didn't have the lilt she used when she called me for Sunday brunch. It was flat, metallic. "We are not here tonight to celebrate a birthday. We are here to save this company." I felt the air leave my lungs. Save the company? I saved the company. I saved it 5 years ago in the basement with a calculator and a prayer. I looked at Mr. Henderson. "Look at me," I begged him silently. "Tell her." But Mr. Henderson was staring intently at his steak knife, refusing to lift his head. "I am officially presenting the Senior Personnel Restructuring Report," Madeline announced. Restructuring. That's the corporate word for butchery. Behind her, the massive LED screen, the one I had installed to showcase our architectural renderings, flickered to life. But instead of a building, it showed a flowchart. At the top was Madeline, below her was Chloe, and where my name should have been, there was a red X. A thick, jagged cross that looked like a wound. "To let Sterling Group reach the global market," Madeline continued, her eyes locking onto mine, "we must have a foundation of absolute integrity. We must cut out the weak links, the dishonest links." Dishonest? I felt a laugh bubbling up in my throat, hot and hysterical. I was the one who itemized every paperclip. I was the one who refused to take kickbacks from the cement suppliers last year. I was the only honest thing in this room. Bella, she said. She didn't use the microphone for this part. She looked right at me, and for the first time, her mask slipped. I saw pure, unadulterated coldness. You are not a Sterling. The words hung in the air like smoke. You are not a Sterling. I gripped the tablecloth. Mother, I whispered, but the word died on my lips. We have invoked the morality clause of the company bylaws, she said, her voice booming again. And more importantly, we are enforcing the bloodline trust established in Robert's last will and testament. The room gasped. I heard the rustle of expensive fabrics as people shifted in their seats. The bloodline trust. I knew what that was. Robert had set it up to protect the family legacy. It stated that voting shares and liquid assets could only pass to direct biological descendants. Robert had loved me. He had raised me since I was 2. He called me his little architect. He wouldn't have done this. He wouldn't have locked me out. Unless Madeline had convinced him that I wasn't worthy. Unless she had whispered poison in his ear while he was dying. Robert wanted this company to stay in the family, Madeline said, her voice dropping to a tragic whisper that I knew was fake. He didn't know the truth then, but we know it now. It wasn't about the money. I didn't care about the shares. I could build my own fortune. It was the public eviction. She was stripping me of my name, my father, and my history, all in front of the people I worked with every day. She was telling the world that I was a fraud, an imposter who had squatted in her house for 30 years. I looked at Chloe. She was still filming. The red light on her phone pulsed steadily and slowly, like a heartbeat. She was smiling. She knew. They both knew. You can't do this, I said. My voice was louder this time, cracking under the strain. I built this company's reputation. I designed the Skylark Tower. I fixed the structural failure at the marina. You were a paid employee, Madeline cut me off, and a very expensive one. She pressed a button on a remote clicker. The screen changed again. The flowchart vanished. In its place was a document I had never seen before. It looked medical. We tolerated your presence because we are charitable people, Madeline said, leaning into the microphone. But charity has limits, especially when we discovered where you really came from. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Where did I come from? I came from here. I came from her. What are you doing? I asked, standing up. My chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. Sitting down would be wiser, Bella, Madeline said, because you're not going to like the next slide. She pointed the remote at the screen. I wanted to run. I wanted to cover my eyes, but I was frozen, pinned by the gazes of 100 strangers and the lens of my sister's camera. I had walked in here expecting a cake, but Madeline was right. This wasn't a party. It was an autopsy. And she was just picking up the scalpel. The click of the remote sounded like a bone snapping in a quiet room. Click. I looked up at the 20-foot LED screen. This screen was my canvas. I had spent countless nights calibrating these pixels to show the shimmering glass facade of the Skylark Tower, or the complex steel truss systems of the Marina project. I loved this screen because it showed the future. But tonight, It was showing my history, and it was ugly. It was a PDF document, blown up so large that I could see the grain of the scanned paper. At the top, in bold black letters, it said, DNA Paternity Test. I scanned the document, my eyes frantic, searching for the bottom line. I didn't have to look far. The numbers were glowing in red, looming over me like a neon judgment. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the same HVAC system I had optimized for acoustic silence. Now that silence was suffocating me. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me cold, like I was standing naked in the snow. I wasn't a Sterling. I wasn't Robert's daughter, the man who taught me how to hold a pencil, the man who walked me to school, the man who died holding my hand. He wasn't my father. "We didn't want you to know," Madeline said. Her voice cracked. It was a perfect performance. She lowered the microphone slightly, as if she were sharing a painful family secret, but she made sure her voice still carried to the back of the room. "We wanted to protect you from the truth of your origin." Origin. She said it like I was a bacterium, like I was a virus she had been trying to contain. She stepped out from behind the podium, walking closer to the audience. She was playing the role of the saint now, the benevolent queen who had been burdened by a peasant child. 30 years ago, Madeline began, her eyes glistening with unshed artificial tears. Robert and I found a baby. Her mother was a drug addict who overdosed in a public restroom. Her father... She paused for effect, letting the suspense build. Her father was a violent criminal who died in a prison brawl before she was even born. A lie. It had to be a lie. "No," I whispered. My voice was weak, buried under the weight of her narrative. "We took you in," Madeline continued, her voice gaining strength. "We gave you a name. We gave you a home. We tried to scrub the bad blood out of you with private schools and piano lessons. We thought nurture could overcome nature." She looked directly at the camera Chloe was holding. "But we were wrong. You can't fix a faulty foundation. Can you, Bella?" I looked down at my hands. They were trembling against the ivory fabric of my pants. I turned my palms up. Were these the hands of a criminal? Were these the hands of an addict? No. These were the hands that drew the blueprints for the city's safest hospital. These were the hands that stayed late to fix everyone else's mistakes. But the room didn't see my hands. They saw the monster Madeline was painting. I looked at Mr. Henderson again. 5 years ago, I saved his job when he miscalculated the budget for the steel reinforcement. I covered for him. I fixed it. He knew I was good. He knew I was honest. But as I looked at him now, he physically turned his chair away. He picked up his menu, pretending to read the appetizers, refusing to make eye contact with the daughter of a convict. The rejection rippled through the room like a wave. The lawyers, the investors, the partners, people I had shared coffee with, people I had laughed with. They were all engaging in a collective act of shunning. They were terrified, not of me, but of Madeline. If she could do this to the woman she raised for 30 years, what would she do to them if they showed me an ounce of mercy? "It's a biological risk," Madeline said, gesturing to the giant screen where the 0.00% was still burning into my retinas. "And as the trustees of this company, we cannot allow criminal genetics to inherit the Sterling legacy. It's simply bad business." She made it sound so logical, So clinical. She wasn't disowning a daughter. She was removing a hazardous material. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. It was hot and humiliating. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them about the late nights, the sacrifices, the love I had poured into this family. But my throat was closed tight. I was paralyzed by the sheer architectural perfection of her cruelty. She hadn't just stolen my money. She had stolen my past. But Madeline wasn't finished. She walked back to the table and picked up something else. It wasn't the clicker this time. It was a thick, bound document with a black cover. She looked at me, and for a second, her sad mother mask cracked, revealing a tiny, triumphant smirk. "The DNA is why you don't belong here, Bella," she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming hard as concrete. "But this..." She slammed the black book onto the table. "This is why you are going to pay." I thought the DNA test was the execution. I was wrong. The DNA test was just the setup. The real weapon was about to be fired. The thud of the black book hitting the table echoed like a gavel sentencing a prisoner. But Madeline didn't open the book. Instead, she pressed the remote again. The giant LED screen behind her flickered, the DNA results vanishing into blackness. In their place, a spreadsheet appeared. It was an Excel file, endless rows and columns stretching down the screen like a digital cage. I squinted, trying to make sense of the data. Date, item, cost, interest. And at the bottom, in bold, aggressive font size 72, was a number that made my knees buckle. Total debt, $3,842,550.45. $3.8 million. "This," Madeline said, pointing a manicured finger at the screen, "is the ledger of guilt. It is an itemized list of every single penny the Sterling family has wasted on you for 30 years. I felt the room spinning. 3 million? That was impossible. I went to public school until high school. I worked in the cafeteria to pay for my own textbooks at university. I drove a 10-year-old car. I bought my clothes at thrift stores. How could I possibly cost $3 million? "I see you're confused," Madeline said, reading my mind. She zoomed in on a section dated 2005. I was 10 years old then. Line item 402. Maternal time sacrifice, opportunity cost. Value, $200 per hour. Hours, 1,500. Total, $300,000. My mouth fell open. She wasn't charging me for food or clothes. She was charging me for time. She was billing me for every hour she had spent mothering me instead of working. Every time she drove me to soccer practice, she was running a taxi meter in her head. Every time she sat through a school play, she was calculating her lost billable hours. "I am a businesswoman, Bella," Madeline said coldly. "My time is an asset, and you consumed a lot of it." I looked further down the list. Line item 899, reputation management fee. Description: damage control for Bella's lack of social grace at the 2018 gala. Cost: $50,000. I remembered that gala. I had spilled wine because I was exhausted from working a double shift on the blueprints for the new wing. I had stayed up for 48 hours to meet her deadline, and she charged me $50,000 for spilling a drink? This wasn't a bill. It was hatred expressed in mathematics. "You stole our resources," Madeline said. "You stole our time. You stole the life I could have had if I hadn't been burdened with another woman's mistake." She reached out her hand, palm open, expectant. "The keys," she demanded. "What?" I choked out. "The company car," she said. "The Volvo. It's an asset of Sterling Group. You are no longer an employee, and you are certainly not family. Hand them over." My hand went to my pocket. The Volvo was a 2014 model. It had a dent in the bumper, and the heater didn't work in January. But it was mine. It was my safe space. It was the only place I could cry where no one would hear me. It was the only way I could leave. "Mom, please," I whispered. "It's how I get home." "Home?" Madeline laughed. It was a sharp, jagged sound. "You don't have a home, Bella. The apartment on 5th Street? That's company housing. I had the locks changed 20 minutes ago. Security is packing your things into garbage bags as we speak." A gasp went through the room. Even the sharks on the board looked uncomfortable. Taking a job is business. Taking a home is war. I looked at the key fob in my hand. It was warm. I looked at Madeline's cold, expectant eyes. I looked at the graphite stain on my wrist, the mark of the builder who had just been evicted from her own creation. I didn't hand them to her. I threw them. They skittered across the marble table, sliding past the crystal glasses and the funeral lilies, finally coming to a stop right next to the red folder. Clatter. The sound was final. "Good," Madeline said, snatching the keys. "Now you are officially insolvent." I stood there, shivering in my ivory suit. I was standing in the middle of the grand old hotel. I knew the tensile strength of the steel beams above my head. I knew the thread count of the curtains. I knew the exact chemical composition of the concrete in the foundation. I had built this world for them, and now I was homeless inside it. But Madeline wasn't done. She didn't just want to take my things. She wanted to take my future. She tapped the black ledger again, her eyes gleaming with a malice that went beyond money. "But repossession isn't enough to cover a $3 million debt, is it?" she purred. "We need a payment plan, or we need a confession." She pulled a single sheet of paper from the back of the ledger. It was thin, crisp, and terrifying. "You have two choices, Bella," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that screamed danger. "Sign this, or I call the police." The silence that followed the clatter of my keys hitting the table didn't last. It was broken by a sound that haunts my nightmares. The ping, ping, ping of rapid-fire notifications. Chloe stood up. She didn't walk. She prowled. She moved around the table, the heels of her Louboutins sinking into the plush carpet, until she was standing right next to me. The smell of her expensive vanilla perfume was suffocating. She raised her arm, shoving the phone inches from my face. The flashlight was blinding, like a police interrogation lamp, washing out my vision until all I could see was the screen. "Say hi to the world, Bella," Chloe chirped. Her voice was bright, fake, and performed. 50,000 people are watching you right now." 50,000. My stomach turned over. That wasn't just a crowd. That was a stadium. I looked at the top corner of her screen. The viewer count was climbing. 49,000, 50,000, 51,000. And below it, the comments were scrolling so fast they were a blur of white text on a black background. Ping, ping, ping. My eyes locked onto the words. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It's human nature to stare at the car crash, even when you are the one in the wreckage. User_XX99. Look at her face. She looks guilty AF. Rich kid hater. Imagine stealing from your own family, parasite. Truth seeker. That suit probably cost more than my tuition, #scammer. Lola_B. She's not even crying. What a psychopath. They hate you, Bella, Chloe whispered, leaning in close so the microphone would catch the intimacy of her cruelty. Read them. They see right through you. I felt a wave of nausea. These strangers didn't know about the 80-hour weeks. They didn't know I designed the structural retrofit that kept the grand old hotel standing during the hurricane last year. They just saw a woman in an ivory suit being accused by a rich mother. To them, I wasn't an architect. I was just content. I was entertained. I was a villain in a 30-second clip. I felt naked, stripped of my name, my home, my car, and now my dignity. This was modern warfare. They weren't just killing me. They were deleting me. Enough, Chloe, Madeline said. Her voice cut through the digital noise like a knife. Focus. Chloe didn't lower the phone. She just stepped back slightly, keeping me in the frame, ensuring the audience didn't miss the kill shot. Madeline slid the single sheet of paper across the marble table. It stopped right in front of me, next to my trembling hands. I looked at the header. Confession of Judgment and Asset Surrender. You have a choice, Madeline said, her tone shifting from theatrical to transactional. She was the CEO now. Option A. You sign this document. You acknowledge the debt of $3.8 million. You agree to a repayment plan of 50% of your wages for the next 20 years. She paused, tapping a specific paragraph with her emerald-tipped nail. And, she added, her eyes gleaming, you waive all intellectual property rights to every design, blueprint, and schematic you created while under the sterling roof. My breath hitched. My designs? My drawings? Those were my soul. The blueprints for the Children's Hospital wing? The sketches for the Sustainable Housing Project? Those were the only things I had that were truly mine. They were the product of my mind, not her money. You can't take my work, I whispered. I drew those. My name is on the stamps. Your name is a lie, Madeline spat. You used Sterling Resources to draw them. They belong to us. She leaned over the table, her shadow falling over me. Or, option B, she continued, her voice dropping to a terrifying calm. You walk out that door without signing, and tomorrow morning my legal team files a criminal complaint with the district attorney. She pointed at the board members behind her. The general counsel nodded slowly, confirming the threat. The charge will be obtaining property by deception and wire fraud, Madeline recited. You misrepresented yourself as an heir to access company funds. That's a Class B felony, Bella. You'll go to prison for 10 to 15 years. The room spun. Prison. A cell. No windows. No drafting tables. Just concrete walls that I didn't design. Sign the paper, acknowledge the debt, and give us your drawings, Madeline said, pulling a heavy gold fountain pen from her pocket. She uncapped it. The sound was a sharp click. And you stay free. You stay poor, but free. She held the pen out to me. The gold barrel caught the light of the chandelier. You have 5 minutes, she said. The police are already on speed dial. I looked at the pen. I looked at the contract that would enslave me for decades and erase my career. I looked at Chloe's phone, recording my hesitation for 50,000 hungry vultures. The trap was perfect. It was structurally sound. There was no exit. I reached out and took the pen. The metal was cold against my skin. My hand hovered over the signature line. I could feel the graphite stain on my wrist rubbing against the crisp white paper. The shadow architect was about to sign her own death warrant. But as the nib of the pen touched the paper, a drop of ink bled out, forming a tiny black pool. It looked like a black hole, and in that black hole, I remembered something. Not a feeling, not a memory, a number. The ink continued to bleed into the paper, a tiny black vein spreading through the fibers of the contract. I watched it grow. That little black dot was my life. If I signed, I stopped the bleeding. If I signed, the live stream ended, the threats stopped, and I could walk out of here. I would be poor, I would be owned, but I wouldn't be in a cell. 2 minutes, Bella, Madeline said, checking her diamond-encrusted Rolex. She didn't look at me. She looked at the door, as if she could already see the police officers marching in to cuff me. I gripped the gold pen tighter. My knuckles turned white. The logical part of my brain, the architect part that craves structure and safety, was screaming at me. Sign it. Just sign it. You can't fight a corporation. You can't fight a mother who kept receipts for 30 years. You are causing structural damage, Bella. It's time to be demolished. I moved the nib toward the signature line. But then, my eyes drifted back to the LED screen, to the spreadsheet, to the ledger of guilt. Something was bothering me. Not the cruelty, the math. Architects are obsessed with patterns. If a beam is off by 2 inches on the first floor, the roof collapses on the 50th. I stared at the column of expenses. Madeline claims she paid for everything: school, clothes, food. But my brain, running on adrenaline and panic, suddenly pulled a file from the archives of my memory. 6 months ago, late night, I was looking for the blueprints for the West Wing renovation in the physical archives. I had knocked over a box of financial records from the 1990s. One file had spilled out. It was labeled Angel Fund. I remembered picking it up. I saw a wire transfer receipt, $50,000, incoming. The date was 1 month after I was born. Then another receipt, $50,000 the next month, and the next. When I asked Madeline about it the next morning, she had snatched the file from my hand. "That's private equity," she had snapped. "Investors, none of your business." But investors don't pay flat fees. Investors don't pay on the first of every month like child support on steroids. I looked at Madeline now. She was tapping her foot. A nervous tick? No, she was impatient. She wanted this over. Why was she rushing? If she had the police on speed dial, why give me a choice at all? Why force me to sign away my rights if she already held all the cards? Unless my signature was the only thing that could bury the truth. My heart stopped racing. It just stopped. And then it restarted with a different rhythm, a cold, steady beat. The math doesn't work. 1 minute, Madeline announced. "Pen to paper, Bella." I looked at the contract. Waive all rights to intellectual property. Confess to fraud. If I signed this, I wasn't just admitting debt. I was admitting that I was a mistake. I was agreeing to her version of the story, that I was the daughter of a junkie and a thug, saved by the benevolent Saint Madeline. But thugs don't have angel funds. Drug addicts don't wire $50,000 a month for 3 decades. My father wasn't a criminal who died in prison. He was a pay stub. He was a bank account. He was a ghost who had been funding this family while Madeline pretended she was paying for my shoes. I looked at the graphite smudge on my wrist one last time. It wasn't a stain. It was proof that I built things. I built things that stood up to wind, to rain, to gravity. Was I really going to let a piece of paper knock me down? "Time's up," Madeline said, reaching for her phone. "I'm calling the DA." I didn't tremble. I didn't cry. I slowly recapped the gold fountain pen. Click. The sound was small, but in that silent, terrified room, it sounded like a pistol hammer being cocked. I set the pen down on the marble table, gently, right next to the confession. Madeline froze. Her hand hovered over her phone. "What are you doing?" "I'm doing the math," I said. My voice surprised me. It wasn't the voice of a scared daughter. It was the voice of a lead architect finding a crack in the foundation. I stood up. I pushed the chair back. I looked at Chloe, then at the camera, then directly into Madeline's eyes. "You said my father was a criminal," I said, my voice projecting to the back of the room, clear and unwavering. "You said he was a broke addict who died in jail." "He was," Madeline hissed. "Now sign, or you go to prison." "Then explain something to me," I said, pointing at the screen, though the data wasn't there anymore. "If he were a dead criminal, where did the money come from?" Madeline blinked. "What money?" "The Angel Fund," I said. The color drained from Madeline's face so fast, it looked like a time-lapse video. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. $50,000, I continued, stepping closer to the table. Every single month. For 30 years. That's $18 million, Madeline. You didn't spend $3.8 million raising me. You stole $18 million hiding me. The room erupted in whispers. Mr. Henderson dropped his fork. Chloe lowered her phone just an inch, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Who sent the money, Mother?" I demanded, leaning over the table, using her title like a weapon. "Who is the angel? Because dead men don't write checks." Madeline looked past me, her eyes wide with terror. She wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at the shadows in the back of the room, near the sound booth. I turned around, and the silence that followed was heavier than any steel beam I had ever designed. The room didn't just go quiet. It went dead. It was the kind of silence you feel in a building right before the demolition charges blow, a heavy, suffocating pause where the air pressure drops and your ears pop. My question about the $18 million hung in the space between Madeline and me, like a suspension bridge with no pylons. It was impossible, unsupported, and terrifying. Madeline's face had lost its emerald confidence. Her jaw was slack, a tiny muscle twitching violently under her left eye. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She wasn't looking at the camera. Her eyes were locked on the darkness at the back of the room, past the round tables, past the terrified board members, right to the technical booth where the audio guys usually sat. I turned slowly. My heels dragged on the marble. Scrape. The technical booth was a blind spot in the ballroom's architecture. I knew it because I hated it. It was a dark alcove designed to hide the ugly wires and the people who weren't important enough to be seen. But tonight, the shadows there seemed thicker, heavier. And then the shadows moved. A man stepped out. He didn't run. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, terrifying inevitability of a glacier. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a suit that made everyone else in the room look like they were wearing costumes. It was charcoal gray, not black, not blue. A deep slate gray that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. It was bespoke tailoring. I could tell from the way the fabric draped over his shoulders without a single wrinkle, responding to his movement like a second skin. The two security guards near the door, hired muscle with thick necks and itchy trigger fingers, stepped forward instinctively. They were paid to stop intruders. They reached for their belts. But then, the man turned his head, just an inch. He didn't speak. He didn't raise a hand. He just looked at them. It was a look of absolute, crushing authority. It was the look of a man who owns the building, the land under the building, and the bank that holds the mortgage. The guards froze. One of them actually took a step back. They lowered their hands. Who was this? Who could paralyze trained security with a glance? As he walked into the light of the chandeliers, I felt a shock of recognition hit me like a physical blow. I knew that face. I had seen it on the cover of Forbes, on the news, and on the enemy watch list board in Madeline's office. It was Julian Vane. The room gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a hiss. Julian Vane was the Titan. He was the owner of Vane Developments. He was Sterling Group's #1 rival. He was the man who had built half the skyline while Madeline was busy throwing garden parties. He was the enemy. Why was the enemy at my birthday party? My mind raced. Was this a hostile takeover? Did he buy the debt? Was he here to kick me while I was down? He walked past the tables of investors. Men worth millions of dollars shrank in their seats as he passed, terrified that he might look at them. He ignored them all. His eyes were fixed on one point. Not me. Madeline. He stopped 10 feet from the table. He stood there, a pillar of charcoal gray against the white tablecloths. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of sleep deprivation, but the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of someone who has been holding up a collapsing wall for 30 years. Madeline was trembling now, visibly. She clutched the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. "Security!" she squeaked. Her voice was thin, pathetic. "Remove him!" Nobody moved. The silence stretched again, taut as a piano wire. Julian reached into his jacket pocket. The movement was slow. I flinched, expecting a weapon, but he pulled out a pair of glasses. He put them on, adjusting them with a calm precision that was almost insulting in the chaos. Then he spoke. "You don't need security, Madeline," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, and it carried to the back of the room without a microphone. It had the acoustic resonance of a cello. "You need a lawyer." He looked at me then. For the first time, the Titan looked at the shadow. I expected judgment. I expected him to laugh at the girl in the stained suit who had just lost everything. But his eyes, they weren't cold. They were gray, like his suit, and they were filled with a strange, agonizing mixture of pain and validation. He looked at the graphite stain on my wrist. He looked at the red folder. And then he looked at the confession document I had refused to sign. He turned back to Madeline. "She asked you a question, Madeline," Julian said, gesturing to me. She asked where the $18 million came from. "Go away, Julian," Madeline hissed, tears of panic finally spilling over. "You have no business here. You're a criminal. You're a monster." Julian smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the sad, broken smile of a man standing in the wreckage of a house he paid for but was never allowed to enter. "You're right," he said softly. The room leaned in to hear him. "I am a criminal." He took one step closer, invading her space, towering over the emerald dress and the fake tears. "My crime," he said, his voice shaking the crystal glasses on the table, "was trusting you." He reached into his inner pocket again. This time he didn't pull out his glasses. He pulled out a photograph. It was old, the edges worn soft and fuzzy from being touched 1,000 times a day. "And my punishment?" he whispered, looking at me with a devastation that shattered my heart, "was missing 30 years of her life." Madeline screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of defeat. But it was too late. The shadow had emerged, and the Titan wasn't here to take over the company. He was here to claim his daughter. Madeline's scream died in her throat, turning into a wet, jagged gasp. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the hard drives in the server rack at the back of the room. Julian Vane stood there, a monolith in charcoal gray, staring at the woman who had just tried to sell me into debt slavery. I looked from Madeline to Julian. The air felt thin, like I was standing on the edge of a skyscraper with no railing. "You're lying," Madeline choked out, clutching her pearls like a lifeline. "He's lying, Bella. He's a ruthless businessman. He would say anything to ruin our stock price." "The stock price," Julian repeated. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. His voice was deep, resonant, the kind of voice that gives orders that shift skylines. "You threatened to destroy my IPO in 1994, Madeline. Do you remember?" He turned to me. The distance between us was only 10 feet, but it felt like 30 years. "I didn't know you existed, Bella," he said. The words hit me harder than the red folder. Didn't know? But the money, the $18 million. "But the checks," I stammered, pointing at the ghost of the spreadsheet on the screen. "The angel fund." "You sent $50,000 every month." "Yes," Julian said. He took a step closer. His eyes were scanning my face, cataloging every feature. My chin, my nose, the way my hair curled at the temples. It was the way I looked at a finished building, checking if the reality matched the blueprint. "I sent that money to the Angel Memorial Fund because she told me you were dead." Dead. The word hung in the air. I looked at Madeline. She was shrinking, physically shrinking, her shoulders hunched, her head pulled into her neck like a turtle sensing a predator. "She told me you died 3 hours after birth," Julian continued, his voice trembling with a suppressed rage that terrified me more than his shouting ever could. "Respiratory failure. She sent me a death certificate, a cremation receipt." I felt sick. My knees unlocked and I had to grab the edge of the table to stay upright. She had killed me. Before I even took my first step, she had killed me in the mind of the only person who might have loved me. "Then why pay?" I asked. The architect in me needed the logic to work. If I were dead, why pay $18 million? "Because of the threat," Julian said. He reached into his inner pocket again. "Madeline told me that if I didn't pay reparations for the pain I caused her, for the loss of the child, She would go to the press. She would tell the world I abandoned a dying baby. She would destroy my reputation right before Vane Developments went public. He looked at Madeline with pure disgust. So I paid. I paid to keep the memory of my dead daughter safe from the tabloids. I paid because I felt guilty that I wasn't there to save you. Madeline wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the exit sign, calculating her escape route. But there was no escape. The board members were whispering now, looking at their CEO with horror. This wasn't just fraud. This was monstrosity. But Julian wasn't done. I believed her, he whispered, looking back at me. For 30 years, I visited an empty grave. I put flowers on a patch of grass that held nothing. He opened his hand. In his palm sat a leather wallet. It was old, the corners worn down to the suede. It didn't match his expensive suit. It was a relic. But I kept this, he said. He opened the wallet. There, behind a clouded plastic window, was a photograph. It wasn't a studio portrait. It was a grainy black and white ultrasound scan. Thermal paper, the kind that fades if you leave it in the sun, but this one was preserved. I stepped forward. My legs felt heavy like they were encased in concrete. I looked at the image. A tiny, blurry bean shape curled in the darkness of a womb. October 14th, 1993. Julian read the date stamped on the corner. The day I heard your heartbeat for the first time. He pulled the photo out with trembling fingers. On the back, written in faded blue ink, was a single word. Peanut. I called you Peanut, he said, a tear finally escaping his control and tracking down his weathered cheek. Because you were so small. I looked at the photo. Then I looked at the DNA test result, still burning in my mind. 0.00% paternity. Madeline had told the world I was the spawn of a criminal. She had told me I was genetic trash. She had made me believe I was a burden, a cost, a stain on her perfect life. But looking at that man, at the way he held that 30-year-old piece of paper like it was a holy relic, I realized the math had finally balanced. I wasn't a convict's mistake. I wasn't a charity case. I was the daughter of the man who owned the skyline. I looked at my hands again. The graphite smudge on my wrist suddenly didn't look like dirt. It looked like his suit. Charcoal gray, the color of steel, the color of strength. I turned to Madeline. She was still holding the gold pen, the weapon she had tried to force me to use against myself. But the weapon didn't scare me anymore, because the man standing behind me wasn't just a shadow. He was a titan. And for the first time in my life, the titan was on my side. You charged him for a funeral, I said to Madeline, my voice steady, cold, and hard as granite. But you forgot one thing, Mother. Madeline flinched. What? Ghosts don't pay rent, I said, and I am very much alive. Julian stepped up beside me. His presence was like a shield wall. He looked at the board of directors, then at the screen where his money, his $18 million, was displayed. Now, Julian said, his voice dropping to that terrifyingly calm register again. I believe my daughter has some questions about her trust fund. The perspective had shifted. The floor hadn't just tilted, it had completely inverted. I wasn't the defendant anymore. I was the judge. And looking at the panic rising in Madeline's eyes, I knew one thing for sure. The sentencing was going to be brutal. The silence in the room was broken by a sound that made Madeline jump, the sharp clack, clack, clack of a keyboard. It wasn't coming from the stage. It was coming from the dark corner where Julian's assistant, a woman with sharp glasses and faster fingers, had plugged a laptop into the hotel's main server. Madeline frantically pressed buttons on her clicker. "Turn it off! Cut the feed!" she screamed at the audio guys. But the audio guys were looking at Julian. And when a titan looks at you, you don't listen to a desperate CEO. You listen to the man who can buy the building you're sitting in. The giant LED screen flickered. The ledger of guilt, that lie of a spreadsheet, dissolved into static. Then, the screen went black. A second later, it exploded into blue. It wasn't a PowerPoint presentation this time. It was a bank interface. A live, forensic view of a shadowy offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Account holder, Madeline Sterling. Source of funds, Angel Memorial Trust, Julian Vane. I stepped closer to the screen. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a hammer against a wall. The numbers were scrolling fast, a waterfall of transactions going back 30 years. But the number at the bottom was stationary. It was bold. It was undeniable. Total assets diverted, $18,450,000. $18 million. "That's not possible," Mr. Henderson whispered from the front row. He sounded like he was going to be sick. "It's very possible," Julian said. His voice was calm, the voice of a man who reads balance sheets for breakfast. "I hired a forensic accounting firm 3 months ago. We tracked every wire transfer. We tracked every shell company. We found every cent." I looked at the screen. I saw the deposits, $50,000 every single month, like clockwork. Julian had been faithful. He had paid his penance. But then I looked at the withdrawals column. And that's when the rage didn't just burn me. It froze me solid. May 14th, 2015. Withdrawal, $120,000. Label, Asset Acquisition, Emerald Series. I looked at Madeline. She was wearing emerald earrings, massive, glittering green stones that caught the light. I remembered that day. It was my graduation from architecture school. Madeline didn't come. She said she had a migraine. She said she couldn't afford a graduation gift because business was slow. She wasn't sick. She was shopping. She was wearing my tuition on her ears. "You spent it," I whispered. "You spent his money on jewelry." "I invested it!" Madeline shrieked, her voice cracking. "I invested it to save this family." "Let's look at that investment," Julian said coldly. He nodded to his assistant. The screen shifted. A pie chart appeared. It showed where the money went. It didn't go to charity. It didn't go to save the company. 60%. Purchase of Sterling Group shares. Name, Madeline Sterling. 20%. Lifestyle maintenance. 10%. Chloe Sterling Trust. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. She used my father's money meant for a dead baby, to buy the controlling shares of her own company. She used my money to become the boss who fired me. She used my money to buy the Birkin bag sitting at Chloe's feet. But the next line on the screen was the one that broke me. August 20th, 2012. Account balance, $12 million. I stared at that date. August 20th, 2012. I remember that day perfectly. It was the day I signed my student loan papers. I was 18. I was sitting in a cramped financial aid office with flickering fluorescent lights. The loan officer told me I didn't qualify for a grant because my mother was too wealthy on paper, but Madeline refused to co-sign. "You need to learn independence, Bella," she had told me. "Pull yourself up by your bootstraps." So I signed. I signed away my future for a 7% interest rate. I ate instant noodles for 4 years. I worked the night shift at the library for $8 an hour while studying structural engineering. I slept 4 hours a night. I graduated with $150,000 in debt that I am still paying off today. On the day I signed that loan, sitting in terror that I wouldn't be able to afford books, there were $12 million in an account with my name on the source line. "You made me take loans," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the dead silence of the room, it sounded like a scream. "You had $12 million of my father's money, and you made me beg a bank for tuition." Madeline's face was gray. She tried to speak, but her lies had run out. There is no spin for forensic math. I was teaching you character," she stammered. "Character?" I laughed. It was a dry, sharp sound. "You weren't teaching me character. You were embezzling." I turned to the board members. They were staring at the screen, their mouths open. They were looking at the sterling shares section. "She bought her seat at the head of this table with stolen money," I told them. "Which means her shares are illegitimate, which means her vote is void." Julian stepped up beside me. He placed a hand on the table. It was heavy, solid. "It's not just embezzlement, Bella," Julian said. "It's fraud, it's tax evasion, and it's grand larceny." He looked at Madeline, who was now trembling so hard her emerald earrings, my earrings, were shaking. "But there is one more thing the forensic audit found. Something much worse than spending cash." Julian pointed to the final line on the screen. It wasn't a withdrawal. It was a lien. A debt obligation is attached to the account. "Collateral pledged, the Grand O Hotel and intellectual property rights." My blood ran cold. Madeline hadn't just spent the cash. She had used the stolen funds as leverage for something else. She had used my money to secure a massive loan for the company, a loan that was apparently in trouble. "You didn't just steal the past, Madeline," Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper that made the hair on my arm stand up. "You gambled the future, and you lost." I looked at the document on the screen. The bank that held the loan wasn't a random bank. I recognized the logo. It was a stylized V. My eyes snapped to Julian. He wasn't just my father. He wasn't just a witness. He was the bank. And looking at the predatory gleam in his eyes, I realized the trap hadn't been set for me. It had been set for her. And she had just walked right into the kill box. The V logo on the screen seemed to pulse like a warning light. It was the logo of Vane Capital, Julian's bank. Madeline's eyes darted from the screen to Julian, then back to the screen. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, like a bird flying into a window pane. She was trying to do the math, but fear makes you bad at arithmetic. You own the debt?" she whispered. Her voice was so quiet that the microphone barely picked it up. Julian didn't answer immediately. He adjusted his cufflink, a slow, deliberate movement that screamed power. "I bought the debt 3 weeks ago, Madeline. Sterling Group owes $40 million. It was a bridge loan to cover your lifestyle expenses, wasn't it? He checked his watch. It was a Patek Philippe. I knew because I had drawn a custom display case for one just like it in a client's penthouse. And according to the loan agreement, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low rumble, the maturity date is tomorrow. The room gasped. Tomorrow. I can pay it! Madeline screeched. She grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles white. We have assets. We have cash flow. I just need an extension. You don't get an extension, Julian said. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. And you don't get until tomorrow. He pointed to the screen, where the forensic evidence of her embezzlement was still glowing in high-definition blue. Clause 14b, Julian recited from memory. The cross-default provision. I knew that term. I remembered reading it in construction contracts. It meant that if a borrower defaults on any obligation or commits a felony like fraud or embezzlement, the lender has the right to demand full repayment immediately. By stealing from Bella's trust fund, Julian said, you committed a federal crime. That triggers the cross-default, which means, Madeline, the $40 million is due right now. Madeline slumped. It was like watching a skyscraper lose its structural integrity. Her shoulders collapsed. The emerald fire in her eyes went out, replaced by the dull gray look of bankruptcy. I don't have $40 million, she sobbed. It was the first honest thing she had said all night. I know, Julian said. That's why I'm calling in the collateral. He pressed a key on the laptop. The screen changed again. This time, it showed a picture of the building we were standing in, the Grand O Hotel. The loan is secured by real estate, Julian explained, and by all intellectual property owned by Sterling Group. My heart skipped a beat. Intellectual property. That meant my drawings, my blueprints. The designs Madeline had tried to steal from me 10 minutes ago were now the only thing keeping her out of jail. Julian looked at me. He nodded. It wasn't a nod of permission. It was a nod of partnership. He had built the trap, but he was letting me spring it. I stepped forward. The graphite stain on my wrist felt hot. I looked at Madeline. She looked small, pathetic. The titan she feared wasn't Julian. It was the truth. I picked up the ledger of guilt, her stupid Excel spreadsheet demanding $3.8 million from me. I flipped it over. The back was blank. Let's do some real math, I said. My voice was calm, scary calm. I pulled a pen from my pocket, not her gold one, but my own drafting pen. I wrote on the back of her ledger. You claimed I owe you $3.8 million, I said, writing the number down. Okay, let's accept that. Madeline looked up, confused. Hope flickered in her watery eyes. Was I giving in? But, I continued, circling the number, we need to deduct a few things. I wrote a bigger number below it. Minus $18 million, I said. The principal and interest from the angel fund that you stole. The room was silent. I could hear the scratch of my pen on the paper. And then, I said, looking at the screen where my Skylark Tower design was still faintly visible in the background, we need to talk about my fee. Your fee? Madeline choked out. I am the lead architect of Sterling Group, I said. My designs have generated over $200 million in revenue for this family. The Skylark, the marina, the hospital, those are my intellectual property. I wrote a massive number at the bottom of the page. Valuation of IP, $45 million. I did the subtraction. I drew a double line under the final result. So, I said, sliding the paper across the marble table toward her. You want 3.8 million. Fine. Subtract the 18 million you embezzled. Subtract the 45 million in stolen designs. I leaned in close. I could smell her fear. It smelled like stale champagne and sweat. You owe me $60 million, Mother, I whispered. Madeline stared at the number. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. I can't pay that. We'll be ruined. I know, I said. I looked up at the ceiling of the ballroom. I looked at the golden arches I had restored. I looked at the load-bearing columns I had reinforced. I didn't see a hotel anymore. I didn't see a venue. I don't want your cash, I said. I don't want your jewelry. I spread my arms, encompassing the entire room, the entire building, the entire lie she had built. I accept payment in the form of this building. Madeline gasped. You can't. This is my legacy. No, I said, grabbing the red folder, the DNA test she used to hurt me, and tossing it into the trash can next to the table. Thud. It's my collateral. I turned to Julian. Execute the foreclosure. Julian didn't smile. He just picked up his phone and spoke 3 words that sounded like the final nail in a coffin. Seize the assets. Somewhere outside, sirens began to wail. But they weren't coming for me. The sirens wailing outside weren't the high-pitched yelp of a passing ambulance. They were the low, mechanical growl of authority. Blue and red lights began to strobe the ballroom windows, cutting through the warm glow of the chandeliers like police tape at a crime scene. What did you do? Madeline whispered. She was staring at Julian, her face the color of old ash. I didn't do anything, Julian replied, putting his phone back in his pocket. I just forwarded the forensic audit to the FBI this morning. They were very interested in the tax evasion part. Boom. The double doors at the back of the ballroom didn't just open. They were thrown wide. The heavy oak slammed against the walls. The witnesses, the board members, the investors, the family friends, all jumped in unison. But the people walking in weren't guests. They wore navy blue windbreakers with yellow letters stamped on the back. FBI, Economic Crimes. The energy in the room shifted instantly. A moment ago, it was a corporate boardroom. Now, it was a crime scene. Agents moved with a speed that made the expensive suits in the room look sluggish. They didn't go for the buffet. They went straight for the head table. Madeline Sterling? The lead agent asked. He didn't wait for an answer. He knew who she was. You are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny. This is a mistake, Madeline shrieked. She tried to pull away, her heels slipping on the marble floor she had polished with my sweat. I am the CEO. You can't touch me. Call my lawyer. Your lawyer is already in custody, ma'am, the agent said calmly. He reached for her wrists. Madeline flinched. She looked at me, her eyes wide and desperate. For 30 years, she had looked at me with contempt. Now, she looked at me like I was a life raft. Bella, she screamed. Tell them it's a family misunderstanding. Bella, please, I'm your mother. I stood there in my ivory suit. I felt the graphite stain on my wrist pulsing against my skin. I looked at the woman who had charged me for her time. I looked at the woman who had stolen my father's letters. I looked at the woman who had tried to send me to prison 10 minutes ago. I have no mother, I said. My voice was quiet, but in the chaos, it landed like a stone. I was an investment, and you just got liquidated. Click. The sound of the handcuffs locking around her wrists was louder than her scream. It was a metallic, final sound. The sound of a steel door shutting. But the collapse wasn't over. To my left, a different kind of siren was going off. Chloe was hyperventilating. She was still holding her phone, but she wasn't narrating anymore. She was staring at the screen in horror. "Stop it!" she yelled at the phone. "Stop typing! You don't know anything!" I leaned over to look at her screen. The live stream was still running, but the audience had turned. The mob that Madeline had weaponized against me had swung around like a wrecking ball. User_Katie99. OMG, she embezzled from a baby? Truth bomb. That bag is stolen property. Hashtag repo time. Vane fan. Cancel the Sterlings. Disgusting. Lola_B. Unfollowed. Rot in jail. The viewer count wasn't dropping. It was skyrocketing. 70,000 people were watching the Sterling Empire burn in real time. But they weren't watching for fashion tips anymore. They were watching a public execution. "They're ruining me!" Chloe sobbed, tapping frantically to delete comments. But for every comment she deleted, 10 more appeared. You can't delete the truth once it's out. "My brand deals! My sponsors!" "Your brand is dead, Chloe," I said. I reached out and gently took the phone from her hand. Her grip was weak. She was just a child, playing dress-up in a burning house. I looked into the camera lens. I looked at the 70,000 strangers who had judged me based on a lie. "Show's over," I said, and I ended the stream. The screen went black. The silence that followed was heavy. The agents were marching Madeline toward the door. She was weeping now, ugly, heaving sobs that ruined her mascara. She looked back one last time, her eyes locking with mine. I expected to feel happy. I expected to feel a rush of joy, a surge of adrenaline. Revenge is supposed to be sweet, right? But I didn't feel sweet. I didn't feel happy. I felt empty. It was the emptiness of a construction site after the old, rotting building had been demolished. It's not pretty yet. It's just a pile of rubble and dust. But for the first time in 30 years, the ground was clear. The foundation was exposed, and the rot was gone. I looked at Julian. He was standing by the pillar, his face unreadable. He hadn't said a word since the police arrived. He just watched, a silent guardian in a charcoal suit. He wasn't gloating either. He knew the cost of this victory. He had lost $18 million and 30 years of fatherhood to get to this moment. The room emptied out. The board members scrambled for the exits, terrified of being associated with the name Sterling. The waiters vanished. The music had long stopped. It was just me, Julian, and the empty tables covered in half-eaten food. I looked around the grand ballroom. My collateral. I own this room now. I owned the chandeliers. I owned the marble. I owned the silence. "It's over," Julian said softly. He stepped closer, but he didn't try to hug me. He knew I was still fragile, like fresh concrete that hasn't cured yet. "No," I said, looking at the door where Madeline had disappeared. I unbuttoned my ivory jacket. It felt heavy, suffocating. I took it off and draped it over the chair where I was supposed to have signed my life away. I looked at my blouse. The graphite stain was still there on my skin, underneath the fabric. Permanent. It's not over, I said, turning to the Titan who was finally visible. The demolition is done. Now, we have to build something new. But as I walked toward the exit, leaving the wreckage of my old life behind, I realized one thing. I had the land. I had the money. I had the father. But I still didn't know who Bella was. The shadow architect was gone. But who was going to take her place? The smell of burnt coffee and cheap maple syrup is the most beautiful scent in the world. It smells like freedom. I sat in the red vinyl booth of Joe's Diner, the leather cracked and peeling under my legs. Across from me sat Julian Vane. He was wearing another charcoal suit, costing more than the entire diner, but he looked different. The hard lines around his mouth had softened. He wasn't the Titan today. He was just a dad, trying to figure out how to put ketchup on a burger without making a mess. It had been 3 months since the red wedding at the Grand O Hotel. 3 months since the sirens wailed. 3 months of silence. Julian pushed a plate of fries toward me. Then he slid something else across the sticky table. It was a thick document, bound in blue. The bankruptcy court finalized the liquidation today, Julian said, dipping a fry into mayonnaise, a habit he apparently picked up from my biological mother. The Sterling Group is officially dead. The assets have been stripped. He tapped the blue folder. But the shell remains, he said. The brand, the legal structure. I bought it for pennies on the dollar this morning. He looked at me, his gray eyes serious. It's yours, Bella. You can be the CEO. You can rebuild it. You can make the name Sterling mean something honorable again. I looked at the folder. It was the key to the kingdom. I could walk back into that office. I could sit in Madeline's chair. I could fire everyone who looked away when I was accused. It was the ultimate revenge fantasy. But then I looked at the window. The sun was hitting the glass, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. I thought about Madeline. She was currently in a federal holding facility, awaiting trial. Her bail had been denied because she was considered a flight risk, mostly because she had tried to book a private jet to Ecuador 5 minutes before the FBI kicked down the doors. I thought about Chloe. She was living in a studio apartment in New Jersey, working as a receptionist at a gym. She had tried to launch a comeback tour on TikTok, but the comment section was a war zone she couldn't win. She was learning the hard way that you can't filter reality. I looked back at the blue folder. No, I said. Julian paused. No? I don't want to fix a condemned building, I said. I picked up the folder. It felt heavy with 30 years of lies. The foundation is rotten, Julian. You know what we do with rotten foundations? We demo, he said, a small smile playing on his lips. Exactly, I said. I slid the folder back to him. Let it die. Let the name Sterling fade away. I don't want to be a renovation project. I want to be new construction. I reached into my bag, a simple canvas tote, not a Birkin, and pulled out a roll of paper. I unrolled it on the sticky table, pushing aside the ketchup bottle. It was a sketch. Just pencil on paper, no fancy 3D rendering, just raw imagination. It was a skyscraper. But it wasn't a glass box as Madeline loved. It was twisting, organic, rising from the ground like a tree made of steel and light. It had strong roots. It had a spine. I started a new LLC this morning, I said, pointing to the logo I had drawn in the corner. Julian leaned in, putting on his glasses. He read the name aloud. Vane and Hart Architects. Hart? He asked, his voice catching in his throat. Mom's maiden name, I said softly. I looked it up. I found her birth certificate in the archives you gave me. Julian took his glasses off. He wiped his eyes with a napkin, pretending it was just the steam from the coffee. She would have loved that. She hated the name Sterling. So do I said. We sat there for a long time, just two people in a booth, drawing lines on a napkin. We talked about load-bearing walls. We talked about wind resistance. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about the skyline we were going to build together. As I took a bite of my cherry pie, store-bought, too sweet, perfect, I realized something. Madeline used to tell me that family was about bloodlines and heritage and protecting the brand. She was wrong. The voiceover in my head, the one that had been screaming for justice for months, finally settled down into a quiet wisdom. Gia đình không phải là dòng máu chảy trong huyết quản, I thought, watching Julian sketch a support beam on my drawing. Gia đình là người sẵn sàng đốt cả thế giới để sưởi ấm cho bạn khi bạn lạnh. I had lost 30 years chasing a ghost. I had lost 30 years trying to earn love from a woman who was only capable of calculating interest. But I didn't lose myself. I looked down at my wrist. The graphite stain was fresh today. It wasn't a mark of shame anymore. It was war paint. Ready to get to work? Julian asked, capping his pen. I've been ready for 30 years, I said. I picked up my pencil. The tip was sharp. The paper was white. There were no shadows over me now. I wasn't the shadow architect anymore. I placed the tip of the pencil on the paper. Scritch. It was the sound of a new foundation being poured.